Hey guys, Jake with 80/20 Media here. Today we're going to be talking about the last V8 Vortec engine that's been used in the Silverado and Sierra trucks. We've done previous videos on the 5.3 and the 6.0 Vortec engines, so today we're talking about the 4.8 Vortec. The 4.8 Vortec is the smallest of the V8 Vortecs, and it was predominantly used in the Silverado and Sierra 1500 trucks, as well as the Tahoe, the Yukon, the Express, and Savannah vans. The 4.8 Vortec came out in 1999 and lasted all the way until 2014 when it was phased out in favor of the newer Ecotec 3 engine family. Throughout its 15-year history, there were 3 different variations of the 4.8 Vortec. The first one used the engine code LR4. It was used from 1999 until 2006 and was part of the 3rd generation Vortec engine family. In 2007, GM switched to the 4th generation of the Vortec engine family, and the LR4 got upgraded to be the LY2. It got a little bit of a bump in horsepower, but it was the only V8 across the Vortec engine family to not have variable valve timing in it. But it did have a few technical changes that allowed it to produce just a little bit more horsepower than the LR4 engine variation. The LY2 made it through 2009, and then in 2010 was replaced with the L20, which lasted from 2010 all the way until 2014. This was also part of the Gen 4 engine family, but it did get a couple material upgrades, including the addition of variable valve timing. The one really good thing about the 4.8 Vortec is that it did not get active fuel management, which is an extreme bonus for reliability. For the L20, it also added flex fuel capabilities, and it was no longer used in the Tahoe or Yukon vehicles. It was only offered in the Silverado, Sierra, and then the vans. The Tahoe and the Yukon dropped the 4.8 in favor of the 5.3 with AFM. The 4.8 Vortec is really a de-stroked 5.3 Vortec without AFM, which makes it a little bit more reliable than the 5.3s with AFM. All of the engines are very similar. They all have iron blocks, aluminum heads, cast iron crankshafts, powdered metal rods, and flat top aluminum pistons. The LY2 and the L20 are considered to have better heads just because they had a couple technical design changes that allow them to flow a little bit more. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump into common problems and reliability with the 4.8 Vortec. There are 4 problems that we're going to cover here. However, I'll go ahead and preface them by saying most of them are relatively small problems. The 4.8 Vortec does get a very good reputation for reliability and longevity. So jumping into problems, the first most common one is with the intake knock sensor. The knock sensor sits on the intake manifold and detects engine knock. The sensor fails, which essentially makes the engine think that there's knock going on, so the engine adjusts the timing to try to correct the knock, which is typically caused by pre-detonation. It'll throw a P0332 engine code, and it'll throw timing off and essentially give you a bunch of performance-related problems with the engine, such as misfires, rough idling, lack of acceleration, and overall poor running. Fortunately, the knock sensor is a $50 part, and it's a very simple DIY that just about anyone can do by themselves, and it's pretty easy to diagnose since you will get that P0332 engine code with it. The second thing is water pump failure. The water pumps on these engines aren't necessarily bad. This, however, is more so a maintenance item just since these engines are getting older now and a lot of them have higher mileage. The water pumps on them tend to fail every 125 to 150,000 miles. And so just something to keep in mind if you have a higher mileage 4.8 Vortec or if you're looking at purchasing a higher mileage one. The water pumps are only about $100. The DIY is a little bit more time consuming, and so if you're having a shop do it, it's going to end up being a little bit more expensive than that. But overall, not a very difficult DIY for someone with a little bit of experience. And again, not really that much of a problem considering it's easy enough to fix, and it typically doesn't happen unless you're at high mileage, and the water pump has a lot of miles on it as well. The third thing is very similar to water pump failure. However, it's with the fuel pump. The fuel pump that sits within the fuel tank tends to fail every 125 to 150,000 miles as well. Now, the fuel pump itself is actually probably a little bit less problematic than the fuel pump control module. The fuel pump control module essentially tells the fuel pump how much fuel to send to the engine. When that module becomes faulty or fails, it'll send incorrect readings to the fuel pump, so it will throw off your air-to-fuel ratios because it'll either be sending too much or too little gasoline into the engine. So along with that, you're going to get a lot of performance-related issues like rough idling, misfires, leaner-rich AFRs, trouble accelerating, and so on. Overall, there are two problems within the fueling system on these with the fuel pump and the pump's control module. However, these I wouldn't say are necessarily the most common of problems, and they are relatively fixable and not super expensive, not one of the biggest problems to have with one of these engines. And typically if the fuel pump fails, you're not going to experience any other issues with the truck. You're just going to have it running poorly, or it's not going to start. The fourth thing is with the intake manifold and the intake manifold gaskets. The intake manifolds are made of plastic, so if your engine ever overheats or if it runs hot, the manifold itself is prone to cracking and causing an air leak. And the gaskets on these engines were very poorly designed, so the gaskets fail pretty frequently, which also causes an air leak or a vacuum leak and will lead to your AFRs being off, rough idling, loss of power, and so on. Fortunately, the intake manifolds are relatively easy to replace on these, especially if it's just a gasket problem. Gaskets are very inexpensive. In the grand scheme of the 4.8 Vortec, this isn't very serious of a problem either. So that covers it for our 4 problems. As we think about the problems that this engine has, all of them are relatively small. I kind of consider the water pump and the fuel pump to be more so maintenance items, since that typically only happens once these engines get to very high mileage. But with that being said, none of the problems that this engine has are catastrophic in nature or lead to very expensive repairs. This engine gets a well above average rating for reliability. The small problems that it does have are cheap and easy to fix, and the block, the internals, and all of the major engine components are extremely stout and shouldn't have any problem making it to 250 to 300 plus thousand miles with proper maintenance and care. Now, transmissions do tend to go before the engines go with the 4.8 Vortec. The transmissions usually need to be rebuilt around that 200 to 250,000 mile mark. That also depends how much towing you're doing with it. The more towing you do, the more likely you are to run into transmission problems earlier on. But that's just something to keep in mind with the very high mileage ones of these as well. And so make sure you keep an eye on the transmission if you're at these high mileage levels. That covers it for a video of common problems and reliability with the 4.8 Vortec. If you appreciate this content, stay tuned for all of the future GM videos that we're going to be releasing by subscribing to our channel. We'd appreciate it if you give this video a like and stay tuned for all of our future content.